All right, fellow seekers of slumber and peculiar historical truths. Tonight we're not just picking a bad year, we're pinpointing the absolute, unarguably worst. Imagine waking and the sun simply didn't shine. Not for a day, but for months. That was 536 AD. A year so utterly, globally abysmal, it makes other dark ages look like a picnic. Be profoundly grateful for your morning coffee and a visible sky. If this chilling dive into misery helps you unwind, consider a gentle like and subscribe. As we plunge into this darkness, tell me in the comments, where are you and what time is it? Dim the lights, maybe light a candle, and let's journey to the year the world forgot how to shine. Welcome back. As we settle deeper into the quiet hours, we've already brushed against the unsettling notion of a worst year in human history. It's a somber title, one not bestowed lightly. Historians and scientists, sifting through ancient records and natural archives like tree rings and ice cores, often converge on one particular point in time. This isn't about regional hardship or a single empire's decline. We are speaking of a year that cast a long dark shadow over the entire known world, the year 536 AD, a time when the very rhythm of life, dictated by the sun and seasons, was profoundly, inexplicably broken for everyone. Imagine, if you will, a creeping dread that knew no borders. From the fledgling kingdoms of post-Roman Europe to the sophisticated empires of the East, from the burgeoning civilizations in the Americas to the scattered communities across Africa, something was fundamentally wrong. Contemporary accounts, though sometimes fragmented and geographically disparate, paint a remarkably consistent picture of unusual and disturbing phenomena. It wasn't a localized famine or a singular war that defined this year. It was a shared global experience of darkness and confusion, a blanket of misery that enveloped diverse cultures simultaneously. The most immediate and terrifying sign was the state of the sky. The sun, that constant celestial body, the very source of light and warmth, grew faint. Eyewitnesses from Constantinople to China described it as dim, as if veiled. Procopius, a prominent Byzantine historian writing in real time, noted that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon during this whole year. It wasn't an eclipse, those fleeting moments of shadow. This was a persistent, unnerving twilight that stretched on, month after agonizing month, altering the very color of daylight and casting a pall over the world. For the people living through 536 AD, this prolonged dimming of the sun must have been an event of unimaginable terror and bewilderment. Without the lens of modern science, without any conceivable explanation, what could they have thought? Was it the wrath of the gods? A sign of an impending apocalypse? The very fabric of their understanding of the world would have been shaken. Daily life, agricultural cycles, religious ceremonies, everything was touched by this oppressive, enduring gloom. Fear, undoubtedly, became a constant companion to the chilling physical cold that began to set in as the light faltered. What could possess the power to so drastically alter our planet's atmosphere on such a grand scale? To act like a colossal shroud, filtering out the life-giving rays of the sun across continents? Scientists today believe the culprit was a massive quantity of fine particles, an almost imperceptible dust, lofted high into the stratosphere. This wasn't the smoke of ordinary fires or a passing sandstorm. This was a sustained atmospheric injection, a vast, lingering cloud that encircled the globe, fundamentally changing the energy balance of the Earth below. The true enigma of 536 AD begins here, with this mysterious, pervasive veil. The source of such a monumental atmospheric disturbance remained a profound puzzle for centuries. While ancient chroniclers recorded the strange weather, the dim sun, and the subsequent famines, they could only guess at the ultimate trigger. They lacked the tools to pinpoint an event that could have such far-reaching consequences. Modern investigations, however, point towards an immense explosive force, something capable of breaching the upper atmosphere with terrifying efficiency. The leading theory suggests an event that unleashed an almost unimaginable volume of aerosol-forming gases into the sky, originating from a single, catastrophic point on Earth's surface, an earthly wound that bled into the heavens. With the sunlight drastically reduced, the immediate and most predictable consequence began to unfold. A significant drop in global temperatures, summer months that felt like winter, unseasonal frosts and snowfall in regions that rarely saw it. This wasn't just a fleeting cold snap. It was the onset of what scientists call a volcanic winter, though the people at the time would only have known it as a period of relentless, biting cold. This chilling effect would have been the first devastating domino to fall, directly impacting agriculture and the natural world, setting the stage for widespread hardship, even before the full scope of the disaster became clear to those huddled below. This global dimming and the ensuing cold were not isolated incidents, ending as quickly as they began. Instead, they were the ominous overture to a cascade of calamities. The year 536 AD didn't just bring darkness. It ushered in a period of profound suffering, crop failures on an unprecedented scale, leading to widespread famine, which in turn weakened populations, making them vulnerable to disease. It marked the beginning of one of the bleakest decades, possibly centuries, in recorded history. As we continue our journey into this dull and somber past, we will explore the specific ways this global cataclysm rippled outwards, touching every corner of human existence, and why its echoes still fascinate and sober us today. In our last descent into history's quiet annals, we pondered 536 AD's enigma, a year the world sighed under gloom. The sun grew distant, plunging civilizations into an eerie twilight. We asked what force could orchestrate such dimming. Now we lift the veil on the suspect, a natural force so immense its outbursts could rewrite skies. Evidence from tree rings and ice cores points overwhelmingly to a cataclysmic volcanic eruption, a titan awakening from geological slumber. This wasn't an ordinary mountain venting ash in a localized display. The event contemplated was truly colossal, an eruption so violent it belongs to a rare class that punctuates Earth's deep history infrequently, but with devastating, globe-altering effect. Such an eruption would possess the raw power to inject staggering material amounts, not just into the air we breathe, but far above the troposphere. Punching high into the calm, stable stratosphere, from this lofty altitude the prolonged global impact could then unfold, a silent, insidious creep across the heavens. Pinpointing the exact location of such an ancient eruption is meticulous geological detective work. Time and Earth's shifting crust guard these fiery secrets quite well. Scientific consensus, however painstakingly built, now leans towards key candidates. One prominent theory suggests a massive Icelandic eruption. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica show telltale spikes in sulfate deposits around this period, an atmospheric fingerprint of a large, sulfur-rich volcanic event, likely from higher northern latitudes, making Iceland a strong contender for this atmospheric disruption. Another compelling candidate, with its own geological and archaeological support, lies further south in El Salvador, the Ilopango volcano. Its enormous caldera-forming event is dated by researchers to a timeframe that could align with 536 AD's mysterious haze. Its tropical location means an eruption there could also efficiently distribute aerosols globally. Some even suggest the unsettling possibility of a cluster of major eruptions around this time, perhaps one following another, compounding the dire atmospheric effects. The Earth was in a particularly volatile phase. Regardless of precise origin, singular titan, or multiple events, the fundamental mechanism of disruption is consistent. A powerful volcanic eruption acts like a geological cannon, blasting millions of tons of sulfur dioxide gas far into the stratosphere. Up there, above everyday weather, this gas undergoes a crucial chemical transformation, reacting with water vapor to form a vast, reflective cloud of tiny sulfuric acid droplets, or sulfate aerosols. These nearly invisible aerosols are the key to the ensuing darkness, the substance of the dreaded veil. This stratospheric sulfate aerosol cloud differed greatly from familiar smoke or rain clouds. Ancient sources called it dry fog, a persistent, hazy obscuration, not wet or misty, it simply hung there. It was a diffuse, ethereal dimming of light, a screen between Earth and Sun. These microscopic aerosol particles, invisible individually, are incredibly effective collectively at scattering sunlight back to space, preventing much of it from warming the ground, altering air and light. Once injected into the stratosphere, this aerosol veil began its slow, inexorable spread. High-altitude winds, like vast, unseen sky rivers, carried these minute particles far and wide, primarily across the northern hemisphere initially, but eventually influencing the global atmosphere. It wasn't an instantaneous blackout, but a gradual, insidious thickening of this haze. People would have watched the sun grow progressively weaker, its warmth diminishing, its face a pale, ghostly disk. Contemporary accounts from the Mediterranean to China echo this chilling observation. They speak of a sun lacking usual brilliance, providing weak light but little heat. Michael, the Syrian, a later chronicler drawing upon earlier sources, described the sun as dark, its darkness lasting 18 months. Each day, he noted, the sun shone for only about 4 hours, this light but a feeble shadow. This wasn't short-lived, it was a tortuously drawn-out atmospheric siege, a test of endurance. Imagine enduring this for 18 long months, a sky never truly cleared. The concept of a bright sunny day would fade from memory, replaced by enduring somber twilight. The moon, too, would struggle, its light dimmed by haze, often with strange halos from high-altitude particles. The celestial clockwork, relied upon for millennia for agriculture and navigation, seemed to falter, its ancient rhythms profoundly disrupted by this shield. This dry fog wasn't just visual, it altered light quality. Colors appeared muted, landscapes desaturated, as if viewed through a dusty, sorrowful lens. The world took on a monotonous, grayish, or sometimes bluish hue. The immense psychological toll of such gloomy skies, with the dawning, terrifying realization of an ongoing climatic catastrophe, must have been a quiet, constant drain on the human spirit, day after relentless, dim day. The phrase darkness at midday sounds like a poetic exaggeration, yet for those in 536 AD, it became unsettling reality. The stratospheric aerosol veil was so effective at scattering sunlight that even at its zenith, the sun's power was severely diminished. Midday might have resembled deep twilight, or light levels of dawn or dusk. Not the swift darkness of an eclipse, but constant, oppressive, unnatural dimness that lingered, casting a pall. Consider the pervasive practical implications of unending gloom. Agricultural work, bedrock of societies then, reliant on clear seasons and strong sunlight, faced profound disarray. Travel became more perilous, simple outdoor tasks, construction and foraging, were rendered far more difficult. Natural cycles of plants and animals attuned to light were disturbed, affecting food chains. Human society, agrarian, was tethered to the sun, that vital tether alarmingly stretched. Beyond these stark practicalities, perpetual twilight's psychological impact is stark. The sun, an ancient symbol of life, hope, and divinity, when seen so conspicuously weakened and distant for so long, would sow deep visceral unease. Cassiodorus, in Roman Italy, wrote of a sun that lost its customary brightness, appearing bluish. He noted even at noon, no shadows of our bodies are to be seen. Such observations paint a vivid, unsettling picture of an alien world. Imagine the eerie, unnatural silence accompanying this pervasive gloom. With considerably less solar energy reaching the surface, atmospheric dynamics could have subtly shifted, perhaps leading to less wind or altered stagnant weather patterns, fostering stagnation. Birdsong might have muted as their cycles were disrupted, daytime insect activity likely diminished. It was a world leached of its usual vibrancy, not just visually, but perhaps audibly too, adding a disquieting layer to the profound sense of wrongness pervading those long months of shadow. Persistent global dimming's immediate inevitable consequence was a chilling, pervasive temperature drop. With significant solar radiation reflected by stratospheric aerosols, less energy reached Earth's surface to warm land, oceans, and air. This wasn't just feeling cooler. It was the insidious onset of anomalous, unseasonal cold, gripping vast planetary swaths, the true, grim start of the volcanic winter, a deep cold born from prolonged darkness. This biting cold wasn't confined to normal winter months, it invaded the entire year. Historical accounts and climate proxies like tree rings reveal summer temperatures plummeted. In many northern hemisphere areas, 536 AD summer, and likely the next, simply failed to materialize. Instead of warmth, there were unseasonal frosts, shortened growing seasons, and startling summer snowfall in temperate zones. The seasons themselves became terrifyingly unhinged from their cycle. The impact of this chilling cold from sun-blocking haze was profound and far-reaching. While the aerosol veil was perhaps densest over the northern hemisphere, depending on the eruption specifics, the cooling effect was undeniably global. Even regions not directly under the thickest veil experienced significant temperature drops as the planet's energy budget fell into deficit. This worldwide chill was the silent, creeping harbinger of famines and societal disruptions destined to follow in the wake of the weakened sun. This relentless cold, with diminished light, created an environment starkly hostile to life. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was perilous. It directly attacked humanity's foundations of survival, food cultivation. Vital warmth for crops to germinate, grow, and ripen was stolen by the persistently veiled sky. The chilling tendrils of this extended volcanic winter began their inexorable grip around the world, setting the stage for unimaginable global hardship, a desperate struggle etched into collective memory and Earth's silent records. As the volcanic veil, that persistent dry fog, continued its long vigil in the upper atmosphere, casting the world into twilight, another more tangible consequence began to assert itself. With the sun's life-giving rays substantially diminished, unable to fully penetrate the stratospheric shroud, the Earth's surface, deprived of its usual warmth, began to cool. This wasn't the fleeting chill of a cloudy day, it was a profound and steady decline, an encroaching cold that seeped into the land and water, heralding a new, unwelcome era. We must understand the temperature drop in 536 AD was not a minor fluctuation. Scientific reconstructions, based on evidence like tree ring growth patterns, which act as natural thermometers, indicate a significant decrease in average global temperatures. For the Northern Hemisphere, it's one of the most severe and abrupt short-term cooling events of the last 2 millennia. This was a climate shock, a sudden lurch downwards on the global thermostat, with immediate implications for every living thing accustomed to the planet's rhythms. While geological and climatic changes can often unfold over centuries, this particular shift was terrifyingly rapid from a human standpoint. Within months of the sky first dimming, the effects of reduced solar radiation became undeniable. People accustomed to the predictable cadence of seasons would have felt the air grow colder, frosts arrive earlier and linger longer, their environment changing before their eyes. It was as if a switch had flipped, plunging vast regions into unseasonable, enduring cold, a stark deviation from ancestral patterns. This pervasive chill altered the sensory experience of the world. Mornings dawned with a sharper bite, even in months that should have been warm. The ground underfoot felt colder, water sources would freeze earlier and thaw later, if at all, during colder months. Homes, often simple structures with rudimentary heating, offered little refuge against a cold that seemed to emanate not just from outside, but from the very sky itself, a constant reminder of the sun's diminished strength. Perhaps the most disorienting and devastating aspect of this new climatic regime was the transformation, or effective cancellation, of summer. That season of expected warmth, abundant light, growth, and ripening simply failed to arrive in its accustomed manner in many parts of the world, particularly across the Northern Hemisphere. The year 536 AD and the years immediately following became infamous in chronicles for their years without a summer, a chilling testament to the sun's feebleness. When summer did nominally appear on the calendar, it bore little resemblance to the season people knew. The days were still long as dictated by Earth's tilt, but the quality of sunlight was poor, weak, and watery, lacking its usual warming power. Temperatures remained stubbornly low, more akin to a cool spring or bleak autumn than the height of summer. Imagine expecting sunshine and warmth, the buzz of insects, the full green of leaves, but instead receiving persistent coolness, gray skies, and an unnerving quiet, as if nature held its breath. The cold of these phantom summers was not merely a lack of pleasant warmth, it was an active, destructive force. Unseasonable frosts, a cruel blight for any farmer, were reported even in midsummer months, nipping at tender shoots and delicate blossoms. In some higher latitude or altitude regions, communities were shocked to witness summer snowfall, a phenomenon far outside their living memory. These were not gentle dustings, but significant enough to further suppress temperatures. The psychological toll of these failed summers must have been immense, adding despair to physical hardship. Summer is intrinsically linked to life, abundance, and renewal. Its failure would have felt like a fundamental betrayal by nature, a sign the world was deeply out of balance. The absence of warm days, ripening fields, and simple summer joys would have eroded morale, fueled anxieties about the future, and perhaps even led to a sense of profound cosmic dread among populations struggling to comprehend. Contemporary Irish chronicles, for instance, poignantly record a failure of bread from 536 to 539 AD, directly linking these bleak, sunless summers to the starvation that followed. Similar whispers of agricultural distress and bizarre weather emanate from other scattered records across Europe and Asia, painting a mosaic of a world struggling under summers that were summers in name only. Offering little solace and less sustenance, the sun had forgotten how to bless the growing season. The direct and most catastrophic consequence of these cold, truncated summers was widespread, repeated agricultural failure. Human civilization, particularly in the 6th century, was overwhelmingly agrarian. The survival of communities, kingdoms, and empires rested squarely on each year's harvest. With the summers of 536 AD and subsequent years proving disastrously cold and dim, this foundation began to crumble with terrifying speed, threatening widespread starvation. Crops, meticulously cultivated over generations to thrive in specific climates, simply could not cope with this sudden, hostile shift. Many staple grains, like wheat and barley, require a certain number of growing degree days, a measure of accumulated warmth, to mature. With temperatures staying low, this thermal threshold was never reached. Late frosts killed young seedlings or prevented pollination. Even if some plants survived, weak sunlight and short growing windows meant they often failed to ripen, producing meager yields. This agricultural devastation was not confined to a single unfortunate region. From the terrace fields of Asia to the fertile plains of Europe, reports suggest a similar pattern of distress. Staple crops, the bedrock of diets, rice, various grains, fruits and vegetables, all suffered. The consistency of this impact across diverse geographical areas underscores the global nature of the cooling event. No single farming technique could easily overcome such a fundamental lack of warmth and light. It is crucial to understand this was not merely a poor harvest or a lean year, terms implying a temporary shortfall. What unfolded was a systemic agricultural collapse in many areas, a multi-year failure of food production systems. Seed stores for the next planting would have been consumed out of desperation. The intricate knowledge of when to plant and harvest, built up over centuries, became unreliable, even misleading in this new, unpredictable climate. The sight of stunted, unripe crops languishing in the fields, or fields that could not be properly planted, would have instilled immediate and profound fear. Granaries would begin to empty with no prospect of normal replenishment. The specter of famine, always a lurking background threat in pre-industrial societies, now loomed larger and more menacingly than for generations. The silent, chilling work of the veiled sun now meant the terrifying prospect of empty bellies. The misery inflicted by 536 AD was not a fleeting episode after which normality swiftly resumed. The initial volcanic aerosol veil may have been densest for around 18 months, but climatic repercussions of such a massive atmospheric shockwave extended far longer. The Earth's climate system, with its vast oceans and ice sheets, possesses considerable inertia. Once perturbed so violently, it does not simply snap back. It entered a prolonged period of instability and cooling. Indeed, many climate historians and scientists now view the 536 AD event as a primary trigger or significant accelerator for a longer period of northern hemispheric and global cooling known as the Late Antique Little Ice Age, or Lalia. This wasn't a true ice age on the scale of Pleistocene glaciations, but a distinct multi-decadal, even multi-century period of cooler temperatures, increased storminess, and altered precipitation patterns, profoundly impacting societies. Initial cooling from volcanic aerosols would have been amplified by feedback mechanisms within Earth's systems. For instance, increased snow and ice cover from colder summers and harsher winters would reflect more sunlight back into space, further cooling the planet. The ice albedo feedback, ocean currents, crucial in distributing heat around the globe, may also have been subtly altered, contributing to the persistence of colder conditions long after the skies had technically cleared. Therefore, the failed harvests and unseasonable cold of 536 and succeeding years were not the end, but the grim overture to a much longer climatic downturn. This mini-ice age, beginning in the mid-6th century, would set the stage for decades of hardship, directly contributing to widespread famines, population movements, social unrest, and perhaps influencing pandemics and the fates of empires. The world was plunged into a colder, harsher state, and humanity would be forced to adapt or perish. The relentless chill and sunless skies following 536 AD, explored previously, led to an inescapable and deeply tragic outcome: widespread crop failure across continents. Fields that should have been heavy with grain stood barren and desolate, plants stunted or withered by the unyielding cold. The gentle rhythm of planting and harvesting, ancient as civilization itself, was brutally interrupted. What should have been a time of communal bounty became a season of silent, despairing observation, as communities faced a harvest that would not, and could not, arrive. In any pre-industrial society, a single failed harvest was a grave matter, but often survivable with carefully managed reserves. However, the agricultural collapse triggered by the persistent volcanic winter was not singular, nor brief. Year after agonizing year, summers failed to warm the earth and crops failed to mature. Whatever meager stores communities possessed, grain hoarded in granaries or household caches, began to dwindle with alarming speed. Soon these vital buffers against utter starvation were exhausted, leaving entire populations exposed and terribly vulnerable. Initial faint hope that the next season might bring long-awaited relief slowly, painfully eroded into dust. As one bleak, unproductive year inexorably bled into the next, the dawning realization must have been terrifyingly clear. This was not a temporary hardship, but a sustained, deepening crisis of survival. The natural world, which had always provided, seemed implacably hostile and unforgiving. This chilling understanding spread a pall of dread far wider than the sun's initial dimming, touching every household reliant on the land for its meager daily bread. This agricultural catastrophe wasn't confined to unfortunate isolated pockets, it was a widespread blight. Historical records, though often fragmented and sparse, paint a grim, consistent picture of immense suffering stretching across vast distances. In Europe, from Ireland, where ancient chronicles speak plainly of a failure of bread, to the normally fertile Mediterranean heartlands of the Byzantine Empire, contemporary accounts tell of severe, prolonged food shortages. Similarly, in Asia, Chinese dynastic histories record highly unusual summer frosts and persistent droughts, all directly contributing to widespread crop failures and devastating famine. The problem was demonstrably hemispheric, if not truly global, in its suffocating reach. Imagine the profound, eerie silence that would have fallen over normally bustling agricultural landscapes during these times. Cheerful harvest sounds, the rhythmic swish of scythes, the communal songs of workers would be replaced by a somber, heavy quiet. Animals, too, felt the biting scarcity, their usual fodder disappearing from the frost-killed pastures. Fields, usually a vibrant patchwork of ripening gold and green, lay starkly fallow or choked with inedible weeds, a constant, painful visual reminder of nature's broken promise and the gnawing hunger beginning to take its relentless hold. With granaries long empty and fields barren year after year, hunger's gnawing grip tightened its merciless hold. At first, a persistent, dull emptiness, an unwelcome distraction. But as days turned into weeks, with critically insufficient food, simple hunger transformed into the debilitating, wasting state of chronic starvation. The human body, desperate for any source of energy, relentlessly consumed itself, first meager fat reserves, then vital muscle tissue. An aching, profound weakness set in, making even the simplest daily tasks an almost insurmountable effort. Lethargy became a constant, unwelcome companion, a heavy shroud. The will to work, to strive, even to merely hope for better days, was systematically sapped by the unceasing, cruel lack of nourishment. Malnutrition also, critically, almost completely, weakens the immune system, leaving populations terrifyingly susceptible to common diseases that might otherwise have been minor, passing ailments. While pestilence would later bring its own distinct horrors, the stage was undeniably being set by this profound, enervating hunger, turning vibrant communities into collections of weakened, spectral individuals. The psychological landscape became as barren and desolate as the failed fields. Chronic hunger mercilessly clouds the mind, breeding deep irritability, profound apathy, and a soul-crushing despair. The simple joy of social interaction, the vital comfort of community bonds, all were severely strained under the relentless, isolating pressure of individual survival. Sleep itself, usually a refuge, offered little true respite, often disturbed by gnawing hunger pangs or anxious, fleeting dreams of food. The once varied world narrowed to a singular, obsessive, and desperate focus, the unending search for anything remotely edible to sustain life. For those unfortunate souls living through these great famine years, hunger ceased to be an occasional passing discomfort and became the grinding, inescapable, and brutal new normal. Each dreary sunrise brought not a glimmer of hope, but simply another long day of gnawing emptiness to somehow endure. The usual, comforting rhythms of life, cherished mealtimes, bustling market days, seasonal festivals, lost all their former meaning, cruelly replaced by a monotonous, agonizing cycle of deepening scarcity and desperate want. This wasn't an acute crisis. It was a slow, torturous descent into a shadowed world defined entirely by lack. Under such extreme, unrelenting, and prolonged duress, society's fragile fabric inevitably frayed, sometimes tearing completely. Traditional, deeply ingrained rules of hospitality and communal sharing, once sacrosanct pillars of community, were mercilessly tested beyond their breaking limits. Formerly friendly neighbors might eye each other's meager, carefully hidden supplies with dark suspicion and envy. Hoarding, if anything precious was left to hoard, became a desperate, perceived necessity for some, yet an unforgivable act of betrayal to others. Food theft, once a rare and petty crime, now starkly meant life or death, leading to harsher, more brutal forms of summary justice or desperate retribution. As all conventional food sources completely vanished from sight, people were relentlessly driven to increasingly desperate and often dangerous measures. The once bountiful landscape itself became a barren field of last, meager resort. Forests, fields, and wastelands were obsessively scoured for anything remotely edible, no matter how unpalatable. People consumed bitter roots, tough grasses, innutritious tree bark, and unfamiliar leaves, so-called famine foods, things not normally considered fit for human consumption, offering precious little real nutrition but, perhaps briefly, cruelly stilling hunger's most acute, relentless pangs. This desperate foraging itself soon became fiercely competitive and utterly exhausting. Hunting and fishing, where any depleted wildlife or fish stocks still miraculously remained, were pursued with a desperate, frantic intensity, quickly exhausting these fragile resources. Precious domestic animals, long cherished for their labor, their milk, or their wool, and absolutely vital for breeding future generations to ensure recovery, were tragically slaughtered and consumed one by one. First the small fowl and pigs, then perhaps the dwindling sheep and goats, and finally, in ultimate, heart-wrenching desperation, the irreplaceable oxen and horses essential for plowing any future fields, a devastating decision that mortgaged an already bleak future for just a few more fleeting days of meager survival. Historical accounts of great prolonged famines, including this very period, often contain grim, veiled allusions to people consuming things normally considered utterly repulsive or strictly taboo in less desperate times. This might tragically include crawling vermin, decaying carrion found by desolate roadsides, or even the tough boiled leather from shoes and belts, stewed for hours to extract some minimal, wretched sustenance. Such harrowing details, though deeply unsettling to us now, grimly underscored the unimaginable, horrific extremity of the prolonged hunger and the powerful primal drive to survive when all other conceivable options had long been exhausted. Basic boundaries of acceptable food simply, tragically, dissolved. Within shattered families, the daily choices must have been agonizing beyond words. How to possibly divide a single pitiful morsel of food too small for even one starving person? Loving parents would undoubtedly sacrifice their own desperate needs for their suffering children, but even this profound act often wasn't nearly enough. The weakest and most vulnerable, the very young with no reserves, and the frail elderly would have been the first to silently succumb, their quiet, inevitable fading, a daily, repeated tragedy in countless, grief-stricken households. Bonds of love and kinship were subjected to the most brutal, soul-destroying test imaginable, a quiet, hidden torment. Faced with certain lingering starvation if they passively remained in their blighted homes, some desperate individuals and entire broken families took the ultimate, desperate gamble of migration. Leaving behind their ancestral lands and all they knew, they set out on perilous, uncertain journeys with no clear destination, driven solely by the faintest, flickering hope that food might somehow be found elsewhere, perhaps over the next barren hill, in the next empty valley, or in some distant, rumored land of mythical plenty. More often than not, however, such desperate hopes were tragically, swiftly unfounded. As the devastating famine was rarely a merely localized affair, these terrible journeys often ended in complete exhaustion, debilitating disease, or lonely death by the desolate roadside. Beyond the devastating immediate consumption of precious seed grain and essential breeding stock, the prolonged famine inflicted another, more insidious, long-term blow to any future societal recovery. Experienced, skilled farmers, themselves weakened or tragically lost to starvation and rampant disease, took their irreplaceable, locally adapted agricultural knowledge and traditions with them to the grave. Essential tools might be broken beyond repair and not mended, or even desperately burned for a fleeting moment of scant warmth. The very delicate continuity of intricate farming practices, painstakingly passed down through countless generations, was severely fractured, making the eventual, hoped-for return to productive agriculture, whenever the harsh climate might finally relent, an even more profoundly daunting prospect for the few, traumatized survivors. The relentless, unceasing, all-consuming hunger inevitably drove still more people to commit acts born of utter stark desperation, further and rapidly eroding the already exceedingly fragile social order. Heated disputes over the tiniest, most insignificant scraps of potential food could quickly escalate into brutal, deadly violence. Lawless banditry might have sharply increased as starving, desperate individuals or organized groups preyed mercilessly upon anyone perceived to have something, anything, however meager, left to spare. Sacred trust, a vital cornerstone of any functioning community, was widely replaced by gnawing fear and deep-seated suspicion. The primal struggle for individual survival threatened to completely unravel the collective societal bonds that held communities together, tragically turning neighbor against desperate neighbor. A profound, unshakable hopelessness must have thoroughly pervaded these wretched, famine-stricken lands for so very long, with no discernible end in sight to the suffering, and the natural world offering no solace or comfort, only continued hardship. It must have felt like a complete and utter abandonment by any benevolent gods or protective fate. The sheer, mind-numbing scale of prolonged human suffering is difficult if not impossible for us to truly comprehend from our distant, comfortable vantage point. Countless millions across vast continents locked in a grim, daily, silent battle against an invisible, insidious enemy that attacked relentlessly from within. This was not merely an abstract historical event, it was an immeasurable accumulation of countless individual, forgotten tragedies, of quiet, hidden desperation playing out daily in the dim, cold light of a sun that had utterly failed its people. The relentless famines that swept across vast swathes of the known world in the wake of 536 AD, which we have previously explored, were not merely a human tragedy, they were also the harbinger of a profound and widespread economic collapse, with agriculture, the very bedrock of 6th century life and prosperity, crippled for years on end. The intricate systems of production, exchange, and governance that depended upon it began to unravel with alarming speed, ushering in an era of deep economic depression in virtually every society of this period. From the grandest empire to the smallest village, the rhythm of economic life was dictated by the success of the harvest. Agricultural surplus was the engine that powered everything else. It fed soldiers, supported artisans, funded rulers, and formed the primary commodity for trade. When this engine sputtered and died due to the prolonged global cooling and failed crops, the entire economic edifice built upon it started to tremble and crack under the strain. Local markets, once bustling with the exchange of goods, grew quiet and barren. Farmers with no surplus to sell had nothing to offer. Likewise, those who might normally purchase food or other wares found their own livelihoods collapsing, their purchasing power extinguished by scarcity and uncertainty. The simple, age-old patterns of local exchange, the lifeblood of rural communities, seized up, replaced by a desperate focus on mere subsistence, if even that was achievable. This collapse at the grassroots level had immediate and severe consequences for larger political entities. Local lords and regional governors who relied on taxes drawn from agricultural output and trade tariffs saw their revenues plummet. Without these funds, their ability to maintain infrastructure, enforce laws, or support their own households diminished, weakening the overall structure of governance from the ground up and leaving many areas to fend for themselves. Beyond the farms, the ripple effects were felt keenly by artisans and those engaged in specialized crafts. When the majority of the population is struggling for basic sustenance, the demand for non-essential goods, fine pottery, new tools, decorative metalwork, or tailored clothing, evaporates. Workshops would have fallen silent, their skilled occupants forced to abandon their trades, perhaps to join the desperate search for food, their irreplaceable skills potentially lost for generations to come. The intricate network of trade routes that crisscrossed continents and seas in the 6th century, arteries of commerce like the famed Silk Road or the busy Mediterranean shipping lanes, also began to suffer catastrophic disruptions. These routes were often already perilous, subject to banditry, political instability, and the whims of nature. The new environmental and social realities made them infinitely more precarious, effectively severing vital connections between distant lands. The primary reason for this collapse was the sheer scarcity of goods. If regions were no longer producing an agricultural surplus, they had little to export. Likewise, luxury items or specialized manufactures, dependent on stable production and available raw materials, also became rare. Merchants found their caravans and ships traveling with lighter loads or not at all, as the well springs of tradable commodities simply dried up under the oppressive global chill. Transportation itself became extraordinarily difficult and hazardous. Lingering atmospheric haze or unpredictable weather patterns, legacies of the volcanic cataclysm, may have continued to impede travel by land and sea. More certainly, the widespread famine and social breakdown fueled a surge in banditry and piracy, as desperate people sought to seize what they could not produce or buy. Weakened states, their own resources depleted, could no longer offer adequate protection to merchant caravans or shipping convoys. Furthermore, the logistics of long-distance travel crumbled. Provisions for travelers, their pack animals, or ship crews became scarce and exorbitantly expensive if available at all. Water sources might be unreliable. The inns and way stations that supported travelers along major routes likely fell into disrepair or were abandoned, making journeys that were already arduous now almost impossible to undertake safely or economically. This led to a domino effect across the interconnected world of 6th century trade. The failure of a key grain-supplying region, for instance, would not only starve its direct customers but also impoverish the merchants, sailors, and port workers involved in its transport. Markets reliant on those grain shipments for their own specialized exports would, in turn, find their economic lifelines cut, triggering a cascade of defaults and commercial failures across the entire network. Prosperous trade centers, cities like Antioch or Alexandria in the Mediterranean, or oasis towns along the Silk Road, which had thrived for centuries on the constant flow of goods and people, would have experienced a shocking decline. Their marketplaces grew emptier, their storehouses unfilled, their cosmopolitan populations diminished by hunger or the departure of those seeking survival elsewhere. The vibrancy of urban commercial life flickered and dimmed. Empires, with their vast territories and complex administrative structures, were particularly vulnerable to this systemic economic shock. The Byzantine Empire, also known as the Eastern Roman Empire, centered in Constantinople, faced an immense struggle. Having just weathered debilitating wars, it now confronted the monumental task of trying to feed its enormous urban populations and maintain its large standing armies, when traditional grain supplies from regions like Egypt and North Africa faltered due to the climatic disaster. The imperial treasury, heavily reliant on tax revenues derived from agricultural land and duties on trade, saw its income shrink dramatically. This financial desiccation severely hampered the Byzantine state's ability to pay its soldiers, fund public works, repair infrastructure damaged by neglect or disaster, or provide any meaningful relief to its starving populace. The gold solidus, the bedrock of Mediterranean currency, while maintaining its purity, would have circulated much less freely as economic activity contracted. Maintaining public order became an increasingly challenging prospect for Emperor Justinian and his successors. When vast segments of the population are gripped by hunger and see no hope of relief from the state, desperation can easily boil over into unrest, riots, or open rebellion. The state's resources to suppress such disturbances were themselves dwindling, creating a dangerous feedback loop of instability and weakening authority. While the Byzantine Empire's struggles are relatively well documented, similar crises undoubtedly gripped other, less chronicled kingdoms and tribal confederations across Europe, Asia, and Africa. From the fragmented successor states in the West to the empires of Persia and the emerging powers in the East, all would have felt the chilling impact of failed harvests, disrupted trade, and the immense challenge of governing populations pushed to the brink of existence by persistent environmental change. What emerged from this confluence of agricultural failure, trade route collapse, and imperial weakness was a widespread and prolonged economic depression. In this pre-industrial context, such a depression meant more than just financial downturn. It signified a fundamental reduction in economic activity, a regression in material well-being, and a significant increase in widespread poverty that touched nearly every level of society, from peasant to noble. The interconnectedness of these factors created a vicious cycle that was incredibly difficult to break. Agricultural collapse led to famine. Famine crippled trade and labor. The collapse of trade weakened states, and weakened states were unable to mitigate the agricultural crisis or restore commercial confidence. This downward spiral would have felt inescapable to those living through it, a seemingly permanent descent into harder, more precarious times. The long-term consequences of this profound economic malaise were manifold. The loss of specialized skills due to the death or displacement of artisans, the depopulation of entire regions from famine and the diseases that inevitably followed, and a noticeable deurbanization in some areas as cities lost their economic rationale, all contributed to a simplification of economic life. Barter may have replaced monetary exchange in some locales, and self-sufficiency rather than interconnected trade became a more pressing, if often unattainable, goal. This deep, enduring economic depression, born from the environmental catastrophe of 536 AD and its aftermath, played a crucial role in shaping the character of the centuries that followed. It contributed significantly to what some historians have termed the Dark Ages or the Late Antique Little Ice Age, a period marked by societal contraction, instability, and a struggle to preserve the remnants of a more prosperous past against the harsh realities of a colder, poorer, and more dangerous world. The profound economic depression and unrelenting famines that gripped the world following the cataclysm of 536 AD, as we've previously discussed, did not occur in a political vacuum. Instead, these relentless pressures acted as powerful solvents, weakening the bonds of state authority and social cohesion, and inexorably fueling a new era of widespread political instability, conflict, and desperate human migration across a darkened and unforgiving landscape. States, from the most formidable empires to smaller, fledgling kingdoms, found their very foundations eroded by the persistent crisis. The agricultural collapse meant a catastrophic loss of tax revenue, the lifeblood of any government. Without a steady flow of income from harvests and trade, rulers struggled to fund the essential pillars of their power: their armies, their administrators, and their infrastructure. This financial crippling left them increasingly unable to respond effectively to the mounting challenges. The legitimacy of rulers often rests on their perceived ability to provide security, justice, and, in times of dire need, sustenance for their people. As famine spread and economies crumbled, the common populace would have seen their leaders as failing in these fundamental duties. This loss of faith, born from prolonged suffering and perceived governmental impotence, created a fertile ground for dissent, disrespect for authority, and ultimately open defiance against a seemingly broken order. Central authorities, even in well-organized states like the Byzantine Empire, often found their control slipping, particularly in outlying provinces. Communication became more difficult, directives from the capital might be ignored or impossible to implement, and local officials, perhaps unpaid and unsupported, could become ineffective, corrupt, or simply abandon their posts. A sense of fragmentation began to creep across once unified territories as the core weakened and the peripheries drifted. The psychological impact of this steady decline in state power cannot be understated. For both the rulers, who may have felt their divinely ordained authority ebbing away, and the ruled, who witnessed the institutions they relied upon falter, it must have fostered a deep sense of anxiety and uncertainty about the future. This familiar structures of the world established state inevitably led to a rise in internal unpredictable and revolts and uprisings, though perhaps not always grand, organized revolutions became more frequent. These were often spontaneous outpourings of desperation, food riots in starving towns where storehouses were rumored to hold grain, peasant revolts against tax collectors demanding payments from people who had nothing left to give, or mutinies among unpaid soldiers. Each such event further chipped away at the state's authority. Banditry, an age-old scourge, flourished in this environment of collapsing order and widespread want. With legitimate means of survival disappearing for many, and with law enforcement weakened or non-existent in many areas, forming outlaw bands became a grimly viable option. These groups preyed upon travelers, raided isolated farmsteads, and further disrupted any lingering, tentative attempts at trade, making movement and commerce even more hazardous and instilling a constant fear in rural populations. At a local level, the very fabric of civil order began to unravel. Established legal processes where they had existed often broke down, replaced by vigilante justice or the arbitrary rule of the strong. Communities driven by fear and scarcity turned inward, becoming deeply suspicious of outsiders or strangers who were often seen merely as more mouths to feed or potential threats. The bonds of wider societal trust were severely eroded. In the power vacuums created by the retreat or collapse of central authority, local strongmen, ambitious military commanders, or opportunistic nobles often rose to prominence. These figures might offer a degree of protection and order within their limited domains, but they also contributed to the political fragmentation of larger states, carving out their own fiefdoms and frequently warring with their rivals for control of scarce resources and terrified populations. Alongside the internal decay of states, another major destabilizing force was unleashed: mass migrations. Driven by the unbearable pressures of starvation, the unyielding cold, and the escalating violence and lawlessness in their homelands, vast numbers of desperate people abandoned their ancestral lands in search of survival elsewhere. These were not planned expeditions, but often chaotic, sorrowful exoduses of families and fragmented communities. These desperate populations sought regions rumored to have food, more clement weather, or simply less violence, even if such rumors were often little more than whispered hopes. The pull factors were often illusory, but the push factors of unendurable suffering were overwhelmingly real. They moved across the landscape like tides of human misery, carrying little but their immediate possessions and the heavy burden of their losses, their numbers often thinned by the perils of the journey itself. The journeys undertaken by these migrating groups were fraught with unimaginable danger. Starvation and disease stalked them relentlessly. They faced the constant threat of attack from bandits or from settled populations who viewed their arrival not with compassion, but as a new threat to their own precarious survival. Rivers, mountains, and desolate plains became formidable obstacles for people already weakened by months or years of deprivation. Many would never reach their intended destinations. The impact of these mass movements was profound, both on the regions they vacated and those they entered. Abandoned lands suffered further depopulation, losing the labor needed for any potential future recovery. The areas that received these influxes of displaced people, themselves often struggling, faced immense new strains on their already inadequate resources, leading to heightened tensions, resentment, and frequently violent conflict between newcomers and established inhabitants. While detailed records are scarce for many regions, it is believed that the environmental and social upheavals of the mid-6th century contributed to significant population shifts across Eurasia and possibly other continents. Nomadic groups may have been set in motion, pastoralists forced to seek new grazing lands, and agricultural communities displaced, all adding to the general tumult and reshaping the demographic map of the era in subtle yet significant ways. This volatile mix of weakened states, widespread internal disorder, and large-scale population movements inevitably culminated in a surge of localized and sometimes larger-scale conflicts. The struggle for dwindling resources, fertile land that might still yield a meager crop, accessible water sources, remaining food stores, or even firewood, became a primary driver of violence at all levels of society. Clashes between migrating groups and settled populations became tragically commonplace. Those trying to defend their ancestral lands and meager resources against desperate incoming strangers often resorted to violence, and the migrants, fighting for their very survival, fought back. These were not wars of imperial conquest in the traditional sense, but brutal, attritional struggles for existence, played out in countless small theaters of misery. Moreover, the ambitious local warlords and regional strongmen who had emerged in the power vacuums now battled each other for dominance. They fought to expand their territories, control trade routes, however diminished, and command the allegiance of the remaining populace, often through force and intimidation. These internecine struggles further devastated the land and its people, adding another layer of man-made suffering to the ongoing environmental crisis. The overall effect was a significant breakdown of the broader peace and civil order that might have existed in earlier, more stable times. While large-scale imperial armies might still march, much of the warfare of this period would have been characterized by its localized, fragmented, and often deeply personal nature. Raids, skirmishes, sieges of small fortified places, and relentless guerrilla-style warfare that offered no security to anyone. This era of heightened political instability, with its constant undercurrent of violence, migration, and the collapse of authority, further entrenched the difficult conditions that had been set in motion by the climatic catastrophe. It ensured that any potential recovery would be slow, painful, and frequently interrupted, contributing significantly to the enduring sense that this was, indeed, one of the bleakest and most challenging periods in which to be alive, a time when the very structures of human society seemed to buckle under unbearable pressure. As the environmental catastrophe triggered in 536 AD cast its long, cold shadow across the globe, its impact was felt with particular poignancy in the heart of what was then, arguably, the world's most formidable state, the Eastern Roman Empire, often referred to by historians as the Byzantine Empire. Under the ambitious Emperor Justinian I, this empire stood, or so it seemed, at a zenith of power and aspiration, yet even this mighty edifice would be profoundly shaken, its grand designs undone, by the silent, insidious workings of a planet in turmoil. The Eastern Roman Empire, in the early decades of the 6th century, was a realm of considerable strength and sophistication. While the Western Roman Empire had fragmented and largely collapsed a century earlier, the East, centered on the magnificent, triple-walled capital of Constantinople, had not only endured but had preserved and continued to develop Roman law, administration, and culture. It commanded vast resources, a professional army, a skilled bureaucracy, and a vibrant, complex economy that connected Europe, Asia, and Africa. At its helm was Emperor Justinian, a ruler of immense energy, intellect, and almost boundless ambition. Ascending to the throne in 527 AD, Justinian was driven by a powerful vision, Renovatio Imperii Romanorum, the restoration of the Roman Empire to its former glory and territorial extent. He saw himself as God's vicegerent on earth, tasked with reuniting a fractured Roman world under one emperor, one law, and one faith. This was a dream of almost breathtaking scale, a testament to imperial confidence. In the early years of his reign, Justinian's ambitions seemed well within reach. His brilliant general Belisarius had achieved stunning victories, reconquering North Africa from the Vandals and much of Italy from the Ostrogoths. Simultaneously, Justinian oversaw a monumental codification of Roman law, the Corpus Juris Civilis, which would influence legal systems for centuries. In Constantinople itself, he embarked on an unprecedented building program, crowned by the awe-inspiring Hagia Sophia, a testament to both imperial power and Christian devotion. A sense of resurgent Roman might filled the air. These grand endeavors, however, demanded colossal resources. Wars of reconquest were incredibly expensive, requiring vast sums for soldiers' pay, supplies, and naval power. Ambitious building projects and administrative reforms also drained the imperial treasury. Yet, in the prosperous early years of Justinian's reign, the empire, though sometimes strained, appeared capable of sustaining this immense output, buoyed by established trade networks and agricultural productivity from its fertile provinces. It seemed, for a fleeting moment, that the Roman eagle might once again soar over a reunited Mediterranean world. Then, in 536 AD, the shadow arrived. Byzantine chroniclers, most notably Procopius of Caesarea, who served as a secretary to Belisarius and was an eyewitness to many events of the reign, described the ominous phenomenon. He wrote that during this whole year, the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, and that it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse, or the beams it shed were not clear. This mysterious dry fog settled over the eastern Mediterranean, including the imperial capital itself, bringing with it an unnerving dimness and a creeping, unseasonable chill. The initial reaction within Constantinople and across the empire would have been one of profound fear and bewilderment. Without a scientific understanding of volcanic aerosols, Such a dramatic and prolonged alteration of the sun's light would have been deeply unsettling. Was it a divine portent, a sign of God's anger? Or was it some unknown malevolent force at work in the cosmos? Superstition and dread would have spread as rapidly as the strange, sun-obscuring haze itself, unsettling the populace and the imperial court alike. The immediate practical effect of the dimmed sun and ensuing cold was a swift and damaging blow to the empire's agricultural heartlands. Anatolia, the Balkans, and even the usually bountiful grain lands of Egypt, though its most catastrophic plague hit was yet to come, would have experienced significantly reduced yields due to shorter growing seasons, lack of sunlight, and unseasonal frosts. The intricate system of grain supply that fed Constantinople's massive population, estimated in the hundreds of thousands, began to falter. As the environmental crisis deepened into the Great Famine years, the Byzantine state, for all its power and organization, found itself struggling profoundly. The challenge of provisioning Constantinople became acute, leading to food shortages, soaring prices, and growing unrest among the urban populace. The meticulously organized Annona, the state system for supplying grain to the capital, was pushed to its breaking point and beyond, unable to cope with a crisis of this magnitude and duration. Simultaneously, the empire's military capacity, the very instrument of Justinian's Renavio Imperii, was severely undermined. Armies campaigning in Italy, North Africa, and on the Persian frontier required vast quantities of grain, fodder, and other supplies. With these resources now scarce and difficult to transport, military operations became more arduous, less effective, and, in some cases, had to be curtailed or abandoned. Soldiers, ill-fed and often unpaid due to plummeting tax revenues, grew restive and their morale suffered. Tax revenues, the engine of the imperial state, dwindled alarmingly as agricultural lands failed to produce and trade routes, as we've explored, became choked and unproductive. Justinian's ambitious building projects, including the continued adornment of Hagia Sophia and the construction of extensive fortifications, slowed to a crawl or ceased altogether. The imperial administration, once a symbol of Roman efficiency, struggled to function as its financial sinews weakened. The dream of a restored empire was confronting the harsh reality of ecological and economic collapse. As if these calamities were not enough, in 541 AD a new horror arrived, likely facilitated by the disrupted environment and populations weakened by years of famine, the Justinianic plague. This devastating pandemic, the first recorded instance of bubonic plague, swept through the Byzantine Empire and beyond with terrifying speed and lethality, killing millions, perhaps a third or even half of the population in a few short years. It was a blow from which the empire, already reeling, would take centuries to truly recover, if it ever fully did. The plague decimated cities, emptied the countryside, and further shattered the already fragile economy and social order. Justinian himself contracted the disease but survived, only to preside over an empire profoundly diminished in manpower, resources, and spirit. His grand armies were hollowed out, his treasury depleted, and his grand vision of a reunited Roman world now seemed like a distant, almost mocking echo from a brighter, irretrievable past. The convergence of the volcanic winter, the subsequent years of famine, and the devastating outbreak of plague effectively derailed Justinian's most cherished ambitions. The reconquest of Italy, already a long and brutal struggle, became an even more protracted and costly affair, leaving much of the peninsula ruined. Plans for further expansion were shelved. The empire was forced onto a defensive footing, struggling merely to hold on to what it possessed against resurgent enemies on multiple fronts. One cannot help but reflect on the almost tragic irony of the situation. An emperor of such formidable will, intelligence, and resources, who sought to rebuild an empire that had once mastered the known world, was ultimately humbled by forces far beyond his control. The immense edifices of Hagia Sophia might reach towards the heavens, but the fate of his empire was still tied to the whims of the earth's climate and the invisible workings of disease, a stark reminder of nature's indifference to human aspiration. The story of Justinian's reign during these calamitous years serves as a poignant illustration of the hubris of human ambition when set against the overwhelming power of the natural world. For all its sophisticated laws, its powerful armies, and its magnificent cities, the Byzantine Empire was, at its core, an agrarian society, utterly dependent on the predictable cycle of the seasons and the bounty of the harvest. When these failed on such a colossal scale, the entire imperial project was imperiled. The dry fog of 536 AD and the subsequent global cooling did not immediately destroy the Byzantine Empire, which would endure in various forms for almost another 1,000 years. However, these events, compounded by the Justinianic plague, marked a crucial and devastating turning point. They inflicted wounds from which the empire arguably never fully recuperated, sapping its demographic and economic strength. and forever altering the trajectory of its history. The dream of restoring the full Roman Empire, so bright in the early years of Justinian's rule, was effectively extinguished in the gloom and cold of the mid-6th century. The energies of the state were increasingly consumed by survival, by defense, and by the slow, arduous process of attempting to rebuild a shattered society. The Golden Age had been abruptly and cruelly cut short, leaving behind a legacy of unfulfilled potential and a somber lesson on the fragility of even the greatest human endeavors. Thus, the plight of the Byzantine Empire under Justinian offers a focused lens through which to view the wider suffering of the era. If this mighty state, with all its resources and administrative capacity, was brought to such a dire pass, one can only imagine the even greater desperation that must have gripped less organized and less resilient societies across the afflicted world. The year 536 AD truly cast a long and devastating shadow, one that even the emperor who never sleeps could not dispel. While the mighty Byzantine Empire reeled under the atmospheric gloom and its dire consequences, as we have just recounted, the tendrils of this global climatic disaster reached far across the known world, even to its misty western fringes. On the island of Ireland, then a land of vibrant Celtic culture and burgeoning monastic learning, far removed from the heartlands of former Roman power, the impact of the year 536 AD and its aftermath was recorded with a stark clarity that offers us a uniquely poignant, localized view of this widespread suffering. Ireland in the mid-6th century was a mosaic of petty kingdoms, or tuatha, each ruled by its own chieftain or king. It was a predominantly rural society, its economy based largely on cattle rearing, which formed the measure of wealth and status, supplemented by the cultivation of hardy grains like oats and barley in its often damp and challenging climate. It lay beyond the frontiers of the Roman Empire, never having been conquered, and was in the midst of a flourishing early Christian period, with monasteries serving as vital centers of learning, art, and, crucially for our story, record-keeping. It is thanks to the diligent work of monastic scribes, who meticulously compiled annals chronicling significant events year by year, that we have such specific insights into Ireland's experience during this dark period. These annals, such as the Annals of Ulster, the Annals of Tigernach, and the Annals of Innisfallen, though sometimes laconic, provide invaluable contemporary or near-contemporary evidence of extreme weather, crop failure, and devastating famine that gripped the island with particular ferocity. These ancient records allow us to trace the arrival of the mysterious atmospheric dust veil even to this verdant isle, typically known for its soft rains and lush green landscapes. While they might not have described a dry fog in the same terms as Mediterranean writers, the consequences they document point to the same overarching cause: a drastic reduction in sunlight and a sudden, uncharacteristic plunge in temperatures, disrupting the familiar patterns of Irish weather. The Irish annals are quite explicit about the extreme cold that descended upon the land. Winters became unusually harsh and prolonged, and, more devastatingly, summers turned cold and failed to bring their customary warmth. For an island with a temperate maritime climate not typically given to sustained extreme cold, this prolonged chill would have been a profound shock to both the people and the natural environment, altering the very character of the seasons they had always known. This unseasonable cold would have had a cascade of effects beyond the immediate discomfort. Native plants may have struggled to grow, affecting wild food sources and fodder for livestock. Animal life, too, would have suffered, with increased mortality among both wild creatures and domestic herds already stressed by a lack of grazing. The delicate ecological balance of the island, adapted to its usually milder conditions, was thrown into severe disarray by this new, imposed climate. The most direct and calamitous impact, faithfully recorded by the annalists, was on agriculture. The cold, sunless summers meant that cereal crops, vital for supplementing the predominantly pastoral diet and providing sustenance through the lean winter months, simply failed to ripen. The energy needed for grains to mature was absent, leaving fields of stunted, unproductive plants where a life-sustaining harvest should have been. Across several sets of Irish annals, a chillingly consistent entry appears for the years around 536 to 539 AD. Perditio panis, a Latin phrase meaning a failure of bread, or more broadly, a loss of food. This simple, stark entry speaks volumes about the dire situation. Bread, made from oats or barley, was a staple. Its failure meant that a fundamental pillar of the Irish diet had collapsed, leading directly to widespread hunger and deprivation. For a society like 6th century Ireland, which, despite its rich culture, possessed relatively limited means of large-scale food storage compared to the great grain-shipping empires, such repeated crop failures over several years were an unmitigated disaster. Each local tuath would have been largely dependent on its own immediate agricultural output. When that failed universally, there was little to fall back on, and the ensuing famine would have been intensely felt at a very local level. The progression from crop failure to famine would have been swift and brutal. Any small surpluses from previous years would have been quickly consumed. As hunger set in, communities would have faced an agonizing decline. The initial scarcity would have given way to widespread malnutrition, weakening the population and leaving it vulnerable to diseases that prey on the undernourished, though the annals of this specific period focus more on the primary lack of food itself. While archaeology in Ireland for this exact period is continually evolving, the stark entries in the annals provide the clearest testament to the suffering. One can imagine the quiet desperation in the ring forts and scattered farmsteads as food ran out, the traditional social obligations of chieftains to provide for their people becoming impossible to fulfill. The songs and stories of the bards, usually celebrating heroes and feasts, might have turned to lamentations for a lost age of plenty. The early death aspect mentioned in our chapter title refers to the inevitable consequence of such severe and prolonged famine, a significant increase in mortality rates. Starvation itself would claim many, particularly the most vulnerable, the young, whose growth was stunted by lack of nutrition, and the elderly, whose reserves were quickly exhausted. Every death was a personal tragedy, a loss to a family and a community. This period of intense hardship would have left deep scars on Irish society. The loss of life could have led to significant demographic shifts, with some areas becoming depopulated. The power structures within and between the tuatha might have been destabilized, as weaker chieftains failed to protect their people from starvation, potentially leading to shifts in allegiance or localized conflicts over dwindling resources, though the annals are less explicit on this immediate political fallout. Monastic communities, though perhaps better organized, were also reliant on agriculture and the support of the surrounding lay population. They too would have suffered during the famine years, their numbers potentially diminished, their ability to carry out their scholarly and religious duties severely hampered. The very act of recording the Perditio Panis in their chronicles was an act of witnessing and remembering profound communal trauma. The detailed, localized accounts from Ireland provide a crucial human dimension to the global catastrophe of 536 AD. They transform an abstract climatic event into a tangible story of suffering in a specific place, among a specific people. The Irish experience, preserved in the sparse but powerful words of the annalists, acts as a microcosm of the devastation that unfolded across many different cultures and landscapes during these bleak years. The long memory of such a profound crisis might also have lingered in Irish oral tradition and folklore, subtly shaping later tales of hardship, magical famines, or the fragility of prosperity. While difficult to trace directly, periods of intense collective suffering often leave enduring echoes in a culture's imaginative landscape, becoming part of its historical consciousness long after the immediate pain has subsided. Therefore, as we contemplate the bad luck that befell Ireland, it serves as a stark reminder that the impact of the 536 AD event was not uniform, but was experienced through the unique lens of each affected society. For the Irish, living on the verdant edge of Europe, the failure of the sun and the subsequent failure of bread brought a period of darkness and early death, a sorrowful chapter meticulously noted by those who endured it, ensuring their story would not be entirely lost to the mists of time. This concrete example from a specific, well-documented region underscores the indiscriminate and pervasive nature of the environmental disaster. No matter how remote or how distinct the culture, societies were bound by their shared dependence on a stable climate. When that stability vanished, the consequences, as seen so clearly in Ireland, were dire, a somber testament to humanity's enduring vulnerability to the forces of nature. As the climatic upheaval of 536 AD reverberated across the globe, casting its chilling shadow from the sophisticated heart of Byzantium to the remote shores of Ireland, its effects were also keenly felt in the far northern reaches of Europe, the lands of Scandinavia. Here, in a world of dense forests, rugged mountains, and deep fjords, communities living at the very edge of viable agriculture faced the environmental crisis with a unique set of responses, leaving behind a legacy not in written words, but etched into the earth and buried in precious metal. Scandinavia, in the mid-6th century, encompassing the regions that would later become Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, was then in its late Germanic Iron Age, a period preceding the more widely known Viking Age by several centuries. Society was organized into chiefdoms and smaller tribal groups, their settlements often consisting of longhouses and scattered farmsteads. Their economy was a mix of agriculture, focused on hardy crops like barley, oats, and rye, alongside pastoralism, hunting, fishing, and a degree of seafaring for trade and contact along the northern coasts. These Norse peoples adhered to their own complex pagan beliefs, a rich tapestry of gods and goddesses, mythical beings, and heroic legends. Deities like Odin, the Allfather, Thor, the thunder god, and Freya, associated with fertility, were revered. The sun, personified as the goddess Sol, or Sunna, held a vital place in their cosmology, her daily passage across the sky essential for warmth, growth, and life itself. Unlike Ireland or Byzantium, this region produced few, if any, contemporary written records detailing their experience of these years, compelling us to turn to the silent testimony of archaeology. And the archaeological record from mid-6th century Scandinavia tells a stark and compelling story. Across many parts of the region there is evidence of a significant societal crisis. Pollen analysis from lakebeds and bogs indicates a decline in cultivated land and an increase in forest cover, suggesting that agricultural fields were being abandoned. Excavations reveal a dramatic reduction in the number and size of settlements in certain areas. With some farmsteads apparently deserted altogether, their inhabitants vanished from the archaeological footprint. For communities already contending with short growing seasons and relatively poor soils, the sudden and prolonged global cooling triggered by the 536 AD event would have been catastrophic. Even a slight decrease in average summer temperatures or a shortening of the frost-free period could render their traditional crops entirely unviable. The failure of harvest year after year would have led directly to food shortages, malnutrition, and a desperate struggle for survival in an already challenging environment. The long winter had arrived with a vengeance. It is tempting, though we must tread carefully as historians, to see echoes of this traumatic period in the later Norse myths of Fimbulwinter, the Great Winter or Mighty Winter. According to these legends, Fimbulwinter was a period of 3 successive winters with no summers in between, a time of immense cold, darkness, and suffering that would presage Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods and the end of the world. While these myths were recorded much later, it is plausible that the collective memory of a real, devastating climatic event like that of the 536 period could have contributed to the imagery and enduring power of such eschatological tales. Alongside the evidence of abandoned farms and shrinking settlements, another more enigmatic archaeological phenomenon marks this period in Scandinavia, a significant increase in the discovery of buried gold hoards. These caches, often found by chance by later farmers or detectorists, contain a remarkable wealth of gold objects. Intricate bracteates, thin, stamped gold pendants, Roman solidi, gold coins obtained through earlier trade or mercenary service, elaborate neck rings, and other pieces of fine jewelry deliberately interred in the earth. The sheer quantity of gold deposited during this specific time frame, roughly the mid to late 6th century, is striking, leading some archaeologists to refer to it as a distinct gold hoard period. These were not casual losses. The careful manner of their burial, often in bogs, near prominent stones, or within the boundaries of settlements, suggests deliberate and meaningful acts. The question that has long puzzled researchers is why these communities, facing such dire hardship, chose to bury such immense wealth, much of which was never retrieved. Several interpretations have been offered for this curious practice. One straightforward explanation is that these hoards represent attempts to secure wealth in a collapsing world. With societal order breaking down, increased raiding, or the abandonment of settlements, people may have buried their most valuable possessions in secret locations, hoping to return and recover them when times improved. The fact that so many hoards remained buried suggests that their owners often did not survive or were unable to return. Another compelling interpretation, particularly given the context of profound environmental crisis, is that many of these gold deposits were ritual sacrifices. In a world where the gods were seen to directly influence natural phenomena, a prolonged period of darkness, cold, and famine might well have been interpreted as divine anger or abandonment. Sacrificing precious gold, the most valuable material available, could have been seen as a desperate attempt to appease these angry deities, perhaps specifically to implore the sun goddess Sol to return with her life-giving warmth, or to persuade the gods of fertility to restore bounty to the land. The placement of some hoards in watery environments like bogs or lakes, often considered sacred liminal spaces in Norse and other Germanic cultures, lends weight to the sacrificial interpretation. These offerings would have been permanently removed from human circulation, given over entirely to the supernatural realm in a grand, perhaps desperate gesture to restore balance and favor from the unseen powers that govern their world. It is also possible that both motivations, safekeeping and sacrifice, played a part, perhaps varying from hoard to hoard or even coexisting within the mindset of those who buried their treasures. Extreme desperation can lead to a blurring of such lines. What begins as an attempt to hide wealth might transform into a final, despairing offering if all other hope is lost. The act of burial itself could have taken on a deep, ritualistic significance in such troubled times. The prolonged dimming of the sun and the relentless cold would have had a profound psychological and religious impact on these sun-dependent northern societies. To see the sun goddess Sol so weakened, her light so feeble day after day, month after month, might have been interpreted as a sign that the very cosmos was out of balance, that the forces of darkness and chaos were gaining ascendancy. It would have been a terrifying validation of their darkest myths, a sign that the gods had perhaps indeed abandoned them. This period of intense crisis, marked by agricultural collapse, settlement abandonment, and the strange phenomenon of mass gold hoarding, likely led to significant societal transformations in Scandinavia. Power structures may have shifted, with some chiefdoms collapsing and others perhaps consolidating power through control of remaining resources, or by leading successful raiding parties. Religious beliefs and practices might also have undergone changes in response to the perceived failure of the old gods to provide. The silence of the abandoned 6th century farmsteads, now just faint traces in the Scandinavian landscape, speaks volumes of depopulation and hardship. The glint of gold, unearthed centuries later from a forgotten hiding place or a sacred offering site, whispers of a time when fear, desperation, and perhaps a final, flickering flame of ritual hope gripped the hearts of those who lived through the long shadow of 536. These material remains are their legacy, a mute testament to their resilience and their suffering. While the direct connection is complex and debated, it is conceivable that the societal disruptions and demographic shifts of this period, alongside the potential changes in worldview, could have contributed in the longer term to the pressures and adaptations that eventually gave rise to the Viking Age a couple of centuries later, an era of expansion, raiding, and exploration born from a transformed Scandinavian society. The memory of a colder, harsher world may have lingered. Thus, the archaeological evidence from Scandinavia provides another crucial piece of the global puzzle of 536 AD. It reveals how a distant volcanic eruption could trigger a cascade of environmental and social consequences, even in remote northern lands, prompting unique cultural responses rooted in local beliefs and dire necessity. The abandoned farms and buried gold of 6th century Scandinavia stand as enduring symbols of a world plunged into crisis, where communities faced the apparent wrath of nature and the silence of their gods with a mixture of practical desperation and profound ritual acts. Just as the world, and particularly the Eastern Roman Empire, was beginning to dimly perceive the full, devastating extent of the prolonged climatic catastrophe that began in 536 AD, an already reeling humanity was about to be struck by a second, even more terrifying blow. The years of cold, darkness, and relentless famine had left populations weakened, societies fractured, and economies in ruins. Into this landscape of profound vulnerability, a new scourge emerged in 541 AD, a pestilence of horrifying lethality known to history as the Plague of Justinian. This was the grim 1-2 punch that would define an already bleak era. By the dawn of the 540s, many regions across Eurasia and Africa had endured nearly half a decade of unprecedented hardship. The persistent volcanic haze had led to failed summers, widespread agricultural collapse, and the Great Famine we have previously described. Trade routes were disrupted, empires were struggling to maintain order, and vast numbers of people were displaced, malnourished, and living in desperate conditions. The very fabric of daily life had been stretched to its breaking point, and the collective resilience of societies was at an all-time low. The physical state of the populace was particularly dire. Chronic malnutrition had weakened immune systems on a massive scale, leaving individuals with little defense against infectious diseases. Displaced populations often congregated in overcrowded, unhygienic conditions, further facilitating the spread of any contagion. The psychological toll of years of unrelenting darkness, cold, and hunger had also left people traumatized, fearful, and perhaps with a diminished will to fight against yet another impending disaster. The world was, in essence, a perfectly prepared breeding ground for an epidemic. And so, in the year 541 AD, the new terror announced its arrival. This was the first historically recorded pandemic of what modern science identifies as bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. While earlier, localized outbreaks of various diseases were common in antiquity, this was different in its scale, its virulence, and its terrifyingly rapid spread across the interconnected world of the 6th century. It would become a defining catastrophe of Emperor Justinian's reign, forever bearing his name. The plague is generally believed to have originated somewhere in Central Asia or East Africa, perhaps smoldering in rodent populations for years before erupting into human society. From its initial focus, often pinpointed by contemporary sources as emerging from the Egyptian port of Pelusium, It began to travel with merciless efficiency. It moved along the still manipulating, though diminished, maritime trade routes of the Mediterranean and overland caravan trails, carried by infected rats and the fleas that infested them, hidden within shipments of grain or other goods. For the people of the 6th century, this was a new and dreadful kind _of illness. While they were no strangers to fevers, fluxes, and other ailments, the specific symptoms and the sheer speed with which this plague killed were unlike anything most had witnessed or heard of in their traditions. Its arrival in a community was often unheralded, its spread seemingly invisible, and its effects utterly devastating, adding a new layer of dread to an already fear-laden existence. The preceding years of famine created what can only be described as a perfect storm for the plague's catastrophic impact. This was the 1-2 punch that broke the back of many communities. Malnourished bodies, already depleted of essential nutrients and with compromised immune responses, simply had no strength left to fight off this aggressive new pathogen. Mortality rates, already tragically high from starvation, soared to unimaginable levels once the plague took hold. The synergy between famine and pestilence was horrifying. Famine drove people from their homes in search of food, often congregating in larger towns or ports where relief was rumored, thereby creating denser populations ripe for infection. These movements also inadvertently helped to transport the disease further and faster than it might otherwise have spread. Those too weak from hunger to flee or to care for themselves became easy victims, their deaths often unrecorded and their bodies unburied. Societies already fractured by years of economic collapse and political instability were in no position to implement effective public health measures. The concept of quarantine was rudimentary at best, and large-scale sanitation efforts were virtually impossible in a world struggling for basic survival. Traditional healers and physicians, where they existed, were overwhelmed and possessed no effective treatments against this bacterial onslaught. Their remedies were often based on superstition or outdated medical theories, offering little comfort and no cure. The Byzantine historian Procopius of Caesarea, an eyewitness to the plague's arrival in Constantinople in 542 AD, left a chilling account of its symptoms and progress. He described the sudden onset of fever, the telltale swelling of lymph nodes into painful buboes in the groin, armpits, or neck, followed by delirium, coma, and often swift death. The sheer terror these symptoms induced and the visible, rapid decay of the afflicted struck at the heart of human courage and social bonds. The initial impact of the plague of Justinian was nothing short of cataclysmic, particularly in the densely populated urban centers of the Eastern Roman Empire. Constantinople, the magnificent capital with its hundreds of thousands of inhabitants, became a charnel house. Procopius reported that at its peak, the plague was killing thousands in the city every day. So many died that there was no one left to bury them. Bodies were piled in the streets or loaded onto boats and cast into the sea. This second wave of mass death, hard on the heels of years of starvation and privation, seemed to extinguish any nascent hopes of recovery from the climatic catastrophe. It was a knockout blow to an already staggering world. The careful structures of society, administration, law, commerce, even religious observance, began to collapse under the sheer weight of mortality and the pervasive atmosphere of terror and despair. The scale of the depopulation was immense. While precise figures are impossible to ascertain, modern estimates suggest that the plague of Justinian, in its initial outbreak and subsequent recurrences over the next 2 centuries, may have reduced the population of Europe and the Mediterranean basin by as much as 50%. Entire villages were wiped out, fertile lands fell fallow for lack of hands to cultivate them, and cities shrank dramatically in size and importance. This biological disaster, striking a world already critically weakened by environmental disaster, ensured that the mid-6th century would be remembered as one of the darkest periods in recorded history. The 1-2 punch of the volcanic winter's famine and then the Justinianic plague reshaped the demographic landscape, further crippled economies, and had profound, long-lasting effects on the political and social trajectory of civilizations across continents. The sense of living through an almost apocalyptic time must have been overwhelming. One disaster had followed another with cruel, unrelenting succession. For the survivors surrounded by death and desolation, it might have seemed as if the world itself was ending, or at least that the known order of things had been irrevocably shattered, leaving behind a future uncertain and deeply shadowed. The plague did not, of course, end life entirely, but it fundamentally altered the conditions of existence. It accelerated many of the societal changes already underway due to the climatic crisis, the decline of urban centers, the weakening of central authority, the disruption of long-distance trade, and added its own unique horrors to the already long list of miseries. This knockout blow ensured that the recovery from the events of 536 AD would not be measured in years, but in generations, even centuries. The deep wounds inflicted on human populations and their societies would continue to fester long after the initial fury of the plague had passed, casting a long, somber influence over the centuries that followed, and cementing the reputation of this era as one of profound suffering and transformation. Thus, the arrival of the plague of Justinian in 541 AD, upon a world already broken by famine and climatic chaos, marked the grim culmination of a series of disasters. It was a period when humanity seemed to be assailed from all sides, by a hostile environment and by an invisible, deadly pestilence. A tragic chapter in the long and often arduous story of our collective past. The succession of calamities that began in 536 AD, the sunless sky, the biting cold, the years of failed harvests leading to devastating famine, the subsequent economic collapse, political instability, and the horrifying arrival of the Justinianic plague, inflicted more than just physical hardship and societal disruption. These events, unfolding over decades, also waged a relentless assault on the minds and spirits of those who endured them. Without the frameworks of modern science to explain such prolonged and multifaceted disasters, people in the 6th century sought understanding through the lenses of their own worldviews, often leading to profound psychological distress, a surge in superstitious fear, and a pervasive belief in divine anger. Imagine living in a world where, for 18 long months, the sun itself, the very source of light, warmth, and life, appeared weak and distant, like a pale moon lingering in a perpetually dusky sky. Then, imagine the summers that never truly arrived, the crops that withered in the fields year after year, the gnawing hunger that became a constant companion, and finally the terrifying, inexplicable pestilence that swept away loved ones with horror. For the people of the 6th century, lacking any knowledge of volcanic aerosols, global climate shifts, or bacterial pathogens, these concurrent horrors must have felt utterly bewildering and deeply malevolent. Traditional knowledge, the accumulated wisdom of generations regarding weather patterns, agricultural cycles, and the treatment of common illnesses, would have proven utterly useless against such unprecedented and sustained anomalies. Folk remedies failed, prayers for sunshine went unanswered, and the established rhythms of nature seemed irrevocably broken. This profound failure of understanding would have stripped away any sense of predictability or control over their environment, leaving communities adrift in a sea of terrifying uncertainty. In this vacuum of scientific explanation, the most readily available and culturally resonant framework for making sense of such overwhelming suffering was a religious one. Across the diverse cultures and belief systems of the 6th century world, from the newly dominant Christianity of the Roman and post-Roman West, to the enduring pagan traditions in Scandinavia and elsewhere, and the sophisticated faiths of Asia, a common thread emerged: the idea that these calamities were not random but were instead a form of divine judgment or punishment. For Christians, the prolonged darkness, famine, and plague could easily be interpreted as the wrath of God, a chastisement for the sins of humanity, perhaps for moral failings, for heresy, or for a perceived lack of piety. Sermons from the period where they survive likely thundered with calls for repentance, for a return to stricter religious observance, as the only means of appeasing an angered deity. The suffering was not meaningless in this view, but a terrible, necessary correction from on high. In the pagan traditions of Northern Europe, the failure of the sun and the unending winter might have evoked terrifying parallels with their own eschatological myths, such as Fimbulwinter, the prelude to Ragnarok, the prophesied doom of the gods and the destruction of the world. The apparent abandonment by Sol, the sun goddess, would have been a cause for profound existential dread, a sign that the cosmic order itself was collapsing and that the forces of chaos were ascendant. Beyond specific theological interpretations, there was a widespread tendency to see such events as unfavorable omens or signs of cosmic imbalance. Unusual celestial phenomena, which sometimes occurred independently but might have been perceived as connected, would only have heightened these anxieties. The dim sun itself was the greatest and most terrifying omen of all, a daily reminder that something was profoundly cosmically wrong with the world, perhaps indicating that the very universe was hostile or indifferent to human suffering. This overwhelming sense of living in a cursed or divinely condemned world fostered a pervasive atmosphere of fear and superstition. When rational explanations failed and established religious reassurances seemed to fall short, people might turn to magical practices, protective amulets, or local folk rituals in a desperate attempt to ward off unseen evils or to find some small measure of control in a world that felt entirely out of control. Scapegoating, too, might have arisen, with blame for the calamities sometimes unfairly cast upon marginalized groups or those perceived as impious or unlucky. The psychological toll of enduring such prolonged and multifaceted trauma must have been immense. Imagine the constant, gnawing anxiety about where the next meager meal would come from, The fear of watching loved ones sicken and die from hunger or plague, the grief of losing children, parents, and entire communities. This was not a short, sharp shock, but a relentless, grinding attrition of body and spirit that lasted for years, even decades, for those who survived the initial onslaughts. Some individuals and communities may have responded with intensified religious fervor, clinging even more desperately to their faith as their only solace and hope. Prayer, fasting, acts of penance, and participation in religious processions would have increased as people sought to make amends with the divine powers they believed they had offended. The building of churches, shrines, or the veneration of relics might have been seen as ways to earn back divine favor and protection. Conversely, others may have experienced a profound crisis of faith, when fervent prayers for relief went unanswered, when piety and ritual failed to alleviate the suffering or ward off death. Some may have begun to doubt the power, the goodness, or even the existence of the gods they had once trusted. This spiritual disillusionment could lead to apathy, despair, or a cynical disregard for former moral or religious constraints in the desperate struggle for personal survival. The impact on daily decision-making would have been significant. With the future so uncertain and seemingly so bleak, long-term planning would have seemed futile. A kind of societal fatalism might have set in, a sense that events were predetermined by forces beyond human influence, leading to a focus on immediate short-term survival, sometimes at any cost. The general morale of entire populations would have been shattered, replaced by a pervasive weariness and a dulled resignation to suffering. The trauma of these years would not have simply vanished once the climate began to slowly stabilize or the worst of the plague receded. Such profound collective experiences are often seared into the cultural memory, passed down through generations in stories, songs, and warnings, even if the specific details become blurred over time. This enduring legacy of fear and loss could have subtly shaped societal attitudes towards risk, authority, and the divine, for centuries to come. Living in a world that seemed to have been abandoned by its protectors, divine or otherwise, would have fostered a deep sense of cosmic insecurity. The sun, once a reliable symbol of life and order, had proven fickle and weak. The earth, once a bountiful provider, had become barren and hostile. The gods, once seen as guardians, now appeared angry, indifferent, or powerless. This feeling of being utterly alone in a menacing universe is a heavy psychological burden for any society to bear. The failure of communal rituals or desperate sacrifices such as the gold hoards in Scandinavia to bring about any discernible improvement in conditions would only have deepened this sense of abandonment and futility. When even the most precious offerings to the supernatural realm yielded no relief, the feeling that the established compact between humans and the divine had been irrevocably broken would have been hard to escape. This collective psychological trauma, this pervasive atmosphere of fear, uncertainty, and perceived divine wrath or indifference, undoubtedly played a significant role in the broader societal transformations that characterized the ensuing centuries. It contributed to the so-called Dark Ages not just through material deprivation, but through a crisis of meaning, a loss of confidence in the old ways of understanding and navigating the world. Therefore, to truly comprehend why it sucked to be alive during the year 536 AD and the decades that followed, we must look beyond the stark statistics of famine and plague, and we must also try to imagine the immense psychological weight carried by those who survived, who had to find ways to make sense of an inexplicable and terrifyingly hostile world, a world where the sun grew dim and the gods themselves seemed to have turned away, leaving humanity to face the darkness alone. The cataclysmic events that began in the year 536 AD, and which echoed through the subsequent decades in the form of prolonged cold, devastating famines, widespread economic collapse, relentless pestilence, and profound political instability, did not simply fade away, leaving the world to quickly resume its former course. Instead, this extended period of global crisis carved deep and lasting scars into the historical landscape, fundamentally reshaping societies and altering the trajectory of civilizations across continents. The mid-6th century was indeed a profound turning point, a grim crucible from which a very different world would slowly and painfully emerge, exacerbating conditions often associated with the term Dark Ages. We have traced the immediate horrors, the sun obscured by a mysterious volcanic haze, the summers that failed to warm the earth, the crops that withered in the fields, the gnawing hunger that became a daily reality for millions, the terrifying arrival of the Justinianic plague, the breakdown of trade and civil order, and the deep psychological wounds inflicted upon survivors. These were not merely a string of unfortunate years, they constituted a systemic shock, a cascade of interconnected disasters that relentlessly battered human resilience and resourcefulness for the better part of a generation, and whose repercussions would resonate for centuries. The term Dark Ages, while viewed by many modern historians as an overly simplistic and often pejorative label for the early medieval period in Europe, still persists in popular imagination to describe an era perceived as one of decline, hardship, and societal regression following the collapse of Roman power in the West. The events of 536 AD and its aftermath undoubtedly fueled many of the very conditions that contribute to this somber perception, acting as a powerful catalyst that deepened and prolonged existing difficulties and created new ones on an unprecedented scale. In the lands of the former Western Roman Empire, which had already fragmented into various Germanic successor kingdoms by the early 6th century, the crisis struck with particular force. These fledgling kingdoms, those of the Franks in Gaul, the Visigoths in Iberia, the Ostrogoths in Italy before their brutal wars with Byzantium, and the Anglo-Saxons in Britain, were already grappling with the challenges of consolidating power, integrating diverse populations, and maintaining the remnants of Roman infrastructure and administration. The environmental and demographic catastrophe of the mid-6th century severely compounded these struggles. Widespread depopulation, resulting from years of famine and the recurrent waves of the Justinianic plague, made it increasingly difficult for these new rulers to muster armies, cultivate sufficient land, or collect adequate taxes. The already tenuous networks of trade and communication, which had once bound the Western Empire together, further deteriorated, isolating communities and regions. This in turn weakened the ability of central royal authorities to project their power effectively, often leading to a greater degree of local autonomy under regional magnates or warlords. The decline of urban life, a process already underway in parts of the West, likely accelerated. Cities, dependent on reliable food supplies from their hinterlands and on commerce, suffered disproportionately from famine and plague. Many shrank in size and importance. Some were abandoned altogether, and the overall economic and social landscape became more ruralized, more localized, and in many respects more primitive than it had been under Roman rule. Literacy and classical learning, though preserved in monastic enclaves, became rarer in the wider secular world. This prolonged period of hardship and instability also left the societies of Western Europe more vulnerable to external pressures. Weakened defenses and depopulated frontiers could invite further migrations or raids from groups on their peripheries, adding another layer of insecurity and conflict to an already troubled era. The dream of a revived Western Empire, if any still harbored it, receded even further into the realm of impossibility. Meanwhile, in the east, the still formidable Byzantine Empire, though it weathered the storm without collapsing entirely, was profoundly weakened and irrevocably changed. As we explored earlier, Justinian's ambitious plans for restoring the full glory of the Roman Empire were largely undone by the combined impact of the climatic disaster, famine, and plague. The demographic losses were staggering, stripping the empire of a significant portion of its manpower for generations to come. This had dire consequences for its military strength, its agricultural output, and its ability to collect taxes. The financial exhaustion resulting from these crises, coupled with a reduced population, left the Byzantine Empire struggling to defend its vast and often volatile frontiers against formidable enemies. In the decades and centuries that followed, it faced relentless pressure from the Sasanian Persians in the east, from Avars and Slavs invading the Balkans, and most significantly from the lightning-fast expansion of the early Islamic caliphates in the 7th century, which would permanently wrest away many of its wealthiest southern and eastern provinces. While Byzantium would demonstrate remarkable resilience and adaptability, surviving for another 9 centuries, it was never quite the same after the mid-6th century. Its territorial extent was significantly reduced, its resources diminished, and its strategic posture often became more defensive and reactive. The calamities of 536 AD and its aftermath thus marked a critical turning point, a high water mark from which the empire, despite moments of resurgence, began a long, slow process of contraction and transformation. Across the broader Eurasian landmass, the cumulative effects of these disasters contributed to a prolonged period of hardship and reduced societal complexity. The disruption to hemispheric weather patterns would have impacted agricultural societies far beyond the reach of Roman or Byzantine chroniclers, from the steppes of Central Asia to the kingdoms of the Far East, each experiencing the crisis in its own way, often leaving only faint traces in their historical or archaeological records. The slower pace of technological innovation, or even the loss of certain existing skills and knowledge in some regions, can be partly attributed to this period of intense societal stress. When communities are focused entirely on survival, there is little surplus energy or resources available for invention, for large-scale public works, or for the patronage of arts and sciences. The intricate machinery of complex societies can seize up and even regress when its fundamental inputs of food, labor, and security are so drastically curtailed. Societal structures themselves were undoubtedly altered. The immense loss of life from famine and plague could lead to shifts in land ownership, changes in the value of labor, and opportunities for new social or political elites to emerge from the chaos. In some areas, it might have led to increased social stratification and exploitation, while in others, it could have paradoxically created new avenues for mobility for the survivors, though often in a much simplified and harsher world. The path to recovery from such a profound global shock was inevitably a slow and arduous one, measured not in years or decades, but in centuries. The repopulation of devastated lands, the rebuilding of ruined economies, the reestablishment of stable political order, and the healing of deep psychological wounds all required immense effort and a great deal of time, often occurring against a backdrop of continued climatic instability associated with the late antique Little Ice Age. In reflecting upon the long-term consequences of the year 536 AD, it becomes clear that this was far more than just a bad year. It was the trigger for a multi-generational crisis that acted as a powerful, disruptive force in world history. It exposed the inherent vulnerabilities of even the most advanced societies of the time to large-scale environmental change and demonstrated how climatic events could cascade through every aspect of human existence, from the global climate to the fate of empires and the inner lives of individuals. While the concept of a singular, monolithic, dark age is no longer favored by most historians, who emphasize regional variations and periods of continuity and innovation, it is undeniable that the era following 536 AD was, for vast numbers of people, a time of profound suffering, increased insecurity, and diminished opportunities. The world became in many tangible ways a more difficult and dangerous place to inhabit. The shadows cast by the dimmed sun of 536 AD lingered long after the volcanic aerosols had cleared from the stratosphere. They fell across battlefields where weakened empires fought for survival, across abandoned fields where once thriving communities had vanished, across marketplaces silenced by the collapse of trade, and across the hearts of people struggling to find meaning in a world that seemed to have been fundamentally broken. This was indeed a critical bottleneck in human history, a period of profound crisis that left an indelible imprint on the medieval world that slowly, and often painfully, rose from its ruins. And so our journey through one of history's bleakest periods draws to a quiet close. We have wandered through the dim, cold corridors of the mid-6th century, a time when the very sky above seemed to turn against humankind. While history is by its nature replete with tales of hardship, conflict, and suffering, the year 536 AD and the grim years that followed in its wake truly stand apart, a stark, chilling testament to a period when a singular global environmental catastrophe plunged diverse civilizations into widespread darkness, profound famine, and an almost unbearable despair. The sequence of events, as we have pieced them together from chronicles, archaeological findings, and the silent witness of tree rings and ice cores, paints a picture of a world teetering on the brink. It began with that mysterious, persistent veil in the atmosphere, likely thrown aloft by a colossal volcanic eruption which obscured the sun for month upon agonizing month. This was no fleeting eclipse, but an enduring twilight that stole the warmth from the earth and sowed a deep, primal fear in the hearts of those who gazed upwards, wondering if true daylight would ever return. This initial atmospheric horror was but the overture to a cascade of further miseries. The drastic drop in global temperatures brought on a miniature ice age, with summers that failed to warm and winters that bit deeper than living memory could recall. Across continents, from the sophisticated heartlands of the Byzantine Empire to the remote green shores of Ireland and the rugged fjords of Scandinavia, the story, though varied in its local expression, echoed with a common theme: agricultural collapse. Staple crops withered, harvests failed repeatedly, and the specter of starvation became a constant, unwelcome guest in countless households. The human cost of this relentless environmental assault is difficult to fully fathom from our distant vantage point. We have spoken of the Great Famine, of people driven to desperate measures to find sustenance, of societal bonds fraying under the intolerable strain of hunger. In such a world, simply surviving each passing day, each cold night, each season of failed hope, was indeed a monumental feat. To be born into such a time, to draw one's first breath under a dimmed sun and face a future so uncertain, was truly an unenviable fate. It was, by any reasonable measure, an awful time to be alive. And as if the relentless cold and hunger were not enough, the populations, already weakened and malnourished by years of privation, then faced the arrival of a new terror, the devastating plague of Justinian. This 1-2 punch, an environmental catastrophe followed swiftly by a biological one, ensured that any nascent hopes for recovery were brutally extinguished. The synergy of famine and pestilence created a perfect storm of mortality, further decimating communities and deepening the sense of living in an accursed age, a world seemingly abandoned by any benevolent force. The psychological toll of enduring such prolonged darkness, both literal and metaphorical, was immense. Without the solace of scientific understanding to explain the failing sun, the persistent cold, or the rampant disease, many sought answers in the realm of the supernatural. It was widely interpreted as divine punishment for the sins of humankind, a sign of the end of the world, or a cosmic judgment from angered gods. Imagine the quiet terror, the deep-seated anxiety, and the pervasive hopelessness that must have settled upon a world that believed itself to be under such a dire, celestial condemnation. This extended period of crisis, beginning so starkly in 536 AD, left an indelible mark on the centuries that followed. It exacerbated the decline of old imperial structures, fundamentally weakened even the most resilient states, and contributed significantly to the widespread suffering, depopulation, and societal regression often associated with the term Dark Ages. It was a critical bottleneck in human history, a time of profound loss and transformation that reshaped the contours of the world to come, a somber foundation upon which later medieval societies would slowly and arduously be built. As you now prepare to drift off into your own well-deserved sleep, perhaps take a quiet moment to remember those who lived through that sunless year and its harrowing aftermath. Consider the deep, unspoken fear they must have felt each evening as the weak, veiled sun dipped below the horizon, unsure if it would return with any greater strength, or if the oppressive gloom was to be their permanent reality. In that reflection, perhaps there is a measure of gratitude to be found for the simple, often unacknowledged stability of your own sky, and for the quiet, steadfast knowledge that the sun will, indeed, rise again with its full warmth and light tomorrow. Thank you for joining us on this rather bleak, but we hope peacefully dull journey into the heart of humanity's worst year. May your dreams tonight be filled with the brightest of sunshine, clear skies, and the comforting reassurance of boring, entirely predictable history. Sleep well.